Hi everyone. I have quite a talent for learning phrases in foreign languages, usually to forget them within about 5 minutes, which is probably about 4.5 minutes longer than most British people. But one phrase that has stuck with me ever since I was involved in scientific skeptical activism, which is going back 10 to 15 years now, is Das ist nicht nur nicht richtig, es ist nicht einmal falsch, which translates as not only is that not right, it's not even wrong. The phrase is attributed to the famous theoretical physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and the not even wrong part eventually took on a life of its own. There's even a Wikipedia page about it. It's usually used about supposedly scientific experiments that are based on flawed reasoning. And it seems very apt for the argument I'm going to talk about now. It's been a while since I had a troll trying to make an argument that I felt compelled to dismantle in a video, but the troll who posted it, who goes by the name of Racer something, seems so convinced that it is insurmountable that he said he's posted it elsewhere on social media as well as on my channel, and for that reason I decided to deal with it. But the main thing is that I knew I would enjoy demolishing it, so it's a little bit self-indulgent. It's a bit of a niche topic really, statistics, but it's the end of the year, it's Christmas, and who doesn't just love looking at statistics at Christmas? So the video he commented under was the last one I did about Emma Vigeland and Erin Reed talking about the so-called anti-trans bathroom panic. And Racer's initial comment is currently pinned under that video, where it has attracted about 60 responses, most of which made serious and valid points, but he ignored all of those and he only responded to me. So the first comment he posted was this one saying, "The bathroom topic is a non-issue and that I'm grasping at straws." And I assumed that he was just another silly drive-by troll, post once, run away, and I did a bit of a knee-jerk response saying it might not be an issue for him, but it is very much an issue for me and for many other women. And I didn't give it another thought until he came back and he made a huge mistake of telling me that it wasn't an issue for me either. What kind of person tells a woman that an issue that has an impact on women isn't an issue for them? And then he said he'd love to see what statistically significant data I had that would indicate that this is an actual issue. And that immediately told me that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't understand the meaning of statistical significance. There was a bit of back and forth before he posted this, which is the comment that inspired this video. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all out, but I'll read bits of it as we're going through. He starts by analogizing black women with men who call themselves women. I have dealt with this disgusting trope in a couple of previous videos, though Racer takes it further than I've ever seen it done before by comparing black women with violent, predatory, trans-identifying men who hurt women and girls. And he says, you can't discriminate against an entire group of people and assume that all of them are exactly the same. So this, in fact, is his argument. There was no need to bring in that false analogy, Racer, or should that be racist? You could have just said that we can't assume all men or all trans-identifying men are likely to molest women. Of course we can't assume that, and of course nobody does assume that. This is a very old, tired, disingenuous and fallacious argument made by trans cultists. I've dealt with it numerous times before, including in the last video when Emma Vigeland kept saying, we assume all trans people are inherently pervy or something like that. We don't. but some of them are, and we can't know which of them are safe to share spaces with. That reason alone is sufficient to keep all of them out and to require them to use the spaces for their own sex. The other reason, which also stands alone, is that we simply don't want them there. They make us feel uncomfortable, anxious, and unsafe. Now, to get onto Racer's main argument here is his real gotcha. What matters is if it's statistically significant enough that we as a society deem it a problem, and if the downsides of trans women using female toilets is actually that much worse for cis women than it is for trans women to be forced to using men's toilets. Now, before I deal with what he says about statistics, I want to point out that in the video that he commented below, I say repeatedly that people should stick to the spaces designated for their sex regardless of what they identify as. Those who call themselves trans women are men, so why shouldn't they use the men's toilets and locker rooms? Racer completely fails to address that question. His starting point is that men who claim to be women should be free to enter women's spaces, and he feels no obligation to justify it. But he contends that we have to justify keeping them out, and the only way we can do this is by producing what he calls statistically significant data. He didn't even attempt to produce any kind of data about why these men shouldn't use men's spaces, but he stated that my position was anecdotal and faith-based. Of course, I responded that believing that men could be any kind of woman was faith-based, to which he replied that he wasn't defending the idea that men are some kind of women. He couldn't care less what they are, he says. He cares about what happens in the real world, backed by data. Well, of course, that's simply not true. He does care what they are, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be spending any time at all challenging our objections. And if he doesn't believe they are a kind of woman, then the default is that he's defending sheer male entitlement to do what they want. He also doesn't care what happens in the real world, because in the real world, some men, including some of those who LARP as women, assault and molest women and girls, and there is a mountain of data to support this. As many of you know, I have a page on my website at peaktrans.org with links to news stories. I devoted an entire video to this subject, giving a very few examples out of hundreds of reported cases, but Racer doesn't care about any of this because he has somehow got it into his head that what matters is whether the rate at which these particular men molest women is statistically significant. So that's what I'll deal with now, because Racer's reasoning here is so wrong. It's not even wrong. It's so flawed on so many levels. It's beyond wrong. There isn't a word in the English language that conveys just how wrong it is, so I'll do that now. The first thing to know is that statistical significance is used in inferential statistics, not in descriptive statistics. It has no application in descriptive statistics, which is what Racer claims to provide. Now, for those who don't know what that means, descriptive statistics refer to whole populations of things. Let's say I run a clinic for people who get migraine headaches. Obviously, I will get relevant information about every individual user of that clinic, every patient. I'll get information about the whole population. I won't just take a few patients as a sample and infer that what is true about them is true about all the users of that clinic. But if a big drugs company wants to test a new treatment for migraine headaches, it won't be able to test the treatment on every person in the world who gets migraines. It will recruit a number of people, a sample population of people who get migraines, and test the treatment on them, together with a control group, probably given a placebo. It will do that for a fixed period, and at the end of that period, they will measure any improvement that was reported, and they will calculate whether that improvement is statistically significant, meaning whether the improvement is more likely to be because of the treatment than because of chance or just random factors. I was going to say some more detail about how statistical significance is calculated, but I don't think I need to, because Racer is not using inferential statistics to arrive at his nonsensical conclusions. He is basing it on the whole population of trans-identifying men in England and Wales. Except that he isn't, because the data he uses is irredeemably flawed. He starts with this. As of March 2024, 295 transgender prisoners were recorded in England and Wales. Now, that figure of 295 transgender prisoners comes from His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service Offender Equalities Report, which tells us that of those 295 prisoners, 50 are female. So we're talking about 245 trans-identifying men in prison. Next, according to data from the 2021 census in England and Wales, approximately 48,000 individuals identified as trans women. He says, of all trans women in England and Wales, only 0.61% of them are in jail. I have to assume he got that figure of 48,000 trans women from Google's AI overview, which he should know is not necessarily accurate. It says that, according to the census, 262,000 people in England and Wales identified with a gender that was different from their sex. 48,000 identified as a trans man, 48,000 as a trans woman, 30,000 as non-binary, and 18,000 wrote in a different gender identity. And 30,000 and 18,000, funnily enough, adds up to 48,000. How about that? Doesn't that seem a little bit sketchy, a little bit sus, that you've got exactly the same number of men as women, and that all the other weirdos combined amount to exactly the same number again? And did you notice that 3 times 48 doesn't come to 262, it comes to 144. There's a difference of 118. So what do the other 118,000 transgender people identify as, if not as trans men or as trans women or non-binary or another gender? Racer took this obviously inaccurate data, assumed it was correct, and he used it to try to make an argument about statistical significance. What an idiot. And he should have known that the figure from the census was challenged as soon as it was published, and it has in fact since been discarded by the Office of National Statistics after they publicly admitted they'd made a seriously embarrassing error in the framing of the question about gender, which had undoubtedly confused thousands and thousands of people who don't have English or Welsh as their first language. The result indicated that those parts of the country, like the part of London I live in, where a majority of the residents are immigrants, that we have more trans-identifying people living in them than bloody Brighton, which is called the LGBT capital of the UK. It is the wokest of woke cities globally. I've never even seen any cross-dressing or gender non-conforming men around here. Well, maybe all those transgenders from India and Romania and Poland just pass exceptionally well, right? The truth is, We do not know how many trans-identifying people reside in England and Wales. I think that about 8,000 or so have had a legal gender change certificate issued, whatever it's called, but we know a far greater number don't have one of those. We do know how many were in prison at the end of March 2024. Just to rub it in, Racer's calculation that only 0.61% of trans-identifying men are in prison was arrived at by calculating the total number of transgender prisoners of both sexes as a percentage of the hugely inflated and inaccurate figure of trans-identifying men taken from the Flawed census. It follows that every other calculation is wrong. He says, if we take 70% for sexual assault crimes for trans women, and he presumably got that figure from this year's newspaper reports like this one, which says at least 181 of the 244 transgender inmates, more than 74%, are in jail for crimes including rape, forcing underage children into having sex, grievous bodily harm and robbery. Those figures are from last February. Racer says, this means that only 0.43% would be in prison for sexual assault. We can disregard that for the same reason as we can disregard the figures, all the other figures he gives. And then he says, this means that only 207 trans women out of 48,000 have ever committed some form of sexual assault. Wow! And we've got 181 of them locked up already? There are only 26 of them left out there that have ever committed sexual assault. Amazing. Oh, how the stupid burns. Amongst his other errors, Racer is, of course, committing the massive one of assuming that conviction rates for sexual assault accurately reflect the incidence of sexual assault, when, in fact, most sexual assaults go unreported, and only about 2% of rapes that are reported in the UK result in a conviction. Very few of them even make it to court. There is loads of information about this in the public domain, and there seems to be no limit to this troll's ignorance. What's next? This means that 99.6% of trans women are not a problem in regards to sexual assault. Even if we grant a few extra points for those who have not been caught, it's still basically nothing. Blah, blah, not statistically relevant. More cis women in the UK have been incarcerated for sexual assault than this and are currently at 3.3%. Hold on a minute. There are about, 35 million adult women living in the UK and about 31 million living in England and Wales, which I think is what he meant, actually. And you're saying that over 3% have been incarcerated for sexual assault? That's nearly 1 million women. There are only 3,500 female prisoners in England and Wales. What are you talking about, Racer? Oh, silly me. Imagine thinking he would use the same method that he used to calculate how many trans-identifying men have committed sexual assault to make the same calculation about women. Of course he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't compare like with like. He'd do something completely different. So to come up with that figure of 3.3%, he's gone back 5 years to 2019 when there were 3,812 women in prison in England and Wales, and 125 of them, 3.3%, had been convicted of sex offences, not necessarily sexual assault. I'm sure I've talked about this before, but most women convicted of sex crimes have been aiding and abetting men, not acting alone or acting as the lead offender. It is, of course, a nonsense anyway to conflate prison statistics from different periods as if prison populations were static and don't change every day. But that's the least of Racer's offences. His greatest offence, in my opinion, is the one I will talk about now. I'm betting that his source for this data about the 3.3% of women is this paper by Professors Rosa Friedman, Kathleen Stock and Alice Sullivan, which was their evidence to the UK Parliament's Women and Equalities Committee on trans-identifying men's offending rates. If you do an internet search on women's offending rates or trans women's offending rates in the UK, this paper could easily be the first hit. It is certainly far easier to access than the original Ministry of Justice source. And if we scroll down the paper, we get to this bit, which says that in March-April 2019, there were 129 trans-identifying male prisoners, so nearly half the number that there are now, or were earlier this year, 76 of whom were sex offenders, which is 58.9%. Compare that to the total number of male prisoners excluding trans, and only 16.8% of them, or nearly 79,000 of them, were sex offenders. And in between those two lines is the stat he quoted about the 3.3% of female prisoners being sex offenders. Female prisoners, not the total adult female population of England and Wales or the whole of the UK. And yet you claimed that more women had been jailed for sexual assault than trans-identifying men had, Racer. You said, in this regard, we should be more afraid of women in women's bathroom, brackets, obviously joking. Your entire intervention into this discussion is a joke, Racer. In fact, you are a joke. Remind me again of what you said about my argument being just from feelings and not from facts and logic. Quote, I just wanted to further illustrate why most reasonable people don't take your argument seriously, at least in the realm of bathroom debates. My argument was that if the presence of men in our spaces make us uncomfortable, then that makes it an issue. We don't have to be physically molested. When I asked him why the feelings of men who want into our spaces were more important than ours, he claimed, the difference is because their feelings have research and data to support justifying allowing them to live the life they want to live. Got that? There is research and data justifying them coming into our spaces even when their presence there is upsetting to us. Is it just as good as the data you've provided that these guys, these violent rapists and molesters of women and children, aren't a significant problem? Get out of here. Okay, I've had enough fun wiping the floor with Racer. If there is a moral to this story, it's probably that if you've got an anonymous troll trying an argument ostensibly based on statistics, don't believe him. He's almost certainly talking out of his arse. I mean, he could have been truthful. He could have said, there are only 76 of them in prison in England and Wales for sex offences. That's not very many. What's a few dozen women and girls being raped or violated by a few bad apples, as he calls them, compared to the need of men to come into our toilets to take a whiz, as he calls it? Hey, that's the trans cult for you. Bye for now, and happy Turfmas.